Hello and welcome to this video that's on My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Now before we begin, we need to look at Robert Browning as a poet. Now he's a Victorian poet, so around about the same time as Charles Dickens, born in 1812 and died in 1889. Now what's interesting and it's related to the poem is that he was born in England but he lived in Italy for a period of time, and so the poem itself is set in Italy, so he does have a kind of understanding of what it's like to live in Italy, and he has a connection to Italy. He was the master of the dramatic monologue, and we're going to look at what dramatic monologue is in a second, but he was an expert at it, and a lot of his poems were dramatic monologues. He was viewed by lots as being very liberal, so very open-minded, left field in terms of his thinking, and he supported the emancipation of women, the freedom of women, and felt that sense of equality between the genders. And subsequently, he wrote a collection of poems which was called Men and Women. So you can see that gender was a particular thing that he was interested in. Now we're going to look at an idea that's related to art and film in particular, but it does have a kind of knock-on effect on terms of what we're looking at. And we're going to introduce the concept of the male gaze. Now, the male gaze, it comes from feminist theory and the idea that women are presented as sexual objects for the pleasure of the male viewer. And this is quite appropriate to when we look at art. Now, a lot of art is painted with the male gaze in mind. Now, the one particular painting I've got here is the Mona Lisa. And it's the idea that a lot of people go, is she smiling? What's she smiling at? But it is about the male gaze. And it's the idea that actually she's there smiling for the man. And so it's about the way that we look at art and how art is designed in a way to appeal to men and to be very, very driven about men seeing women as objects. And so we see this in a lot of art, and we see this in a lot of classical art, and you'll notice, and I've not included them, but a lot of art features women in either as a sexual object or as if it's all about the physical appearance of women. So it's not about their personality or anything about them. It is purely there to please the man. So the whole thing about Mona Lisa in one element is the idea that she's there and she's smiling for the man, and it's all about the man and there. And so the theorists, kind of said that, it's about either the people who are painting being objectifying the woman, or it's about people in the story, or it's about the audience. And I think in Mona Lisa's position, I think it is here, it's about the audience. So men would buy this and the painting, or purchase a painting like this with the idea that it was about them, and so she was smiling at them and there was something about it. So it's a really interesting idea, and so we're going to have a look at that idea of the male gaze and how women are objectified, treated as objects. And that's a really, really important thing when we look at this poem. Now, as I said before, this is a dramatic monologue. And a dramatic monologue, okay, mono meaning one, log as in dialogue. So we've kind of got one conversation. And the way that a monologue works is that you've got one person talking to us. And that person is talking, and we're kind of like a listener. It's like we're part of a conversation. We're not talking back, but we're listening. And what they do with a dramatic monologue is it builds us a picture. And it's like each bit of the story is a jigsaw. And really what dramatic monologues are about is about understanding a person. That's what it's about. So bit by bit, we pick up an understanding of who this person is. And usually it isn't till the end of the dramatic monologue where we actually understand this person in full detail. Now I'm going to go through another Robert Browning's poems before we actually look at My Last Duchess. Now, hopefully, you would have read this in year 8, and so it's a bit of a recap. But if it isn't, it will help you kind of understand what Robert Browning is actually doing with his poems and the dramatic monologue form, because Porphyria's Lover's very similar to My Last Duchess in the way that it's set up and the way that the ideas that it's got in there. Now, I've broken it up because usually the dramatic monologue is just one big block of text, but I've broken it down just to help it a bit easier for when we're reading it. So just listen as I read it. So Robert Browning's Porphyria's Lover. The rain set early into night. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened, with heart fit to break, when glided in Porphyria straight. She shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up, and all the cottage wall. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall, and last she sat down by my side, and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm around her waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread over all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me. Murmuring how she loved me, she too weak, for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free, from pride and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me for ever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain. A sudden thought of one so pale, for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew, while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she. I'm quite sure she felt no pain, as a shut bud that holds a bee. I warily oped her lids again, laughed the blue eyes without a strain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still, the smiling rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all is scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard. And thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Right, that's the poem. Now you can see it's a dramatic monologue. We've got the murderer, Porphyria's lover, talking to us about killing Porphyria. Quite a dark poem. It's very similar to the way that Browning writes about a lot of his poems. But you can see in the poem that male gaze, that objectification of women, because what we see is it's very much the first half of the poem is all about her physical appearance. It's not about her personality as such. It's all about physically and the idea of him possessing, which is a bit like the role of art and the painting, the idea that women can be controlled and women can be kept by a man. And so you can see some really sort of, old attitudes towards the way that men and women deal with each other. So if we have a look in this poem, so this is a dramatic monologue. It is from one person. It is from Porphyria's lover talking. And we're building up that picture. At first, we may think that he's in love with her, but that love is darker. It's a possessive love. It's a controlling love. It's a love that's kind of destructive. It's almost a jealous love that he doesn't want anybody else to have her, so he kills her in a way. And so we're understanding the mindset of this person. Now, from your perspective, you don't need to know that much about Before It's Lover, but it just helps you to understand the way that Robert Browning is writing his poem and how he's writing and what's the reasons. Now, one thing to view Robert Browning is as a social commentator. So he's commentating on life, what's going on in the world around us. And in the poem, we can see here that we can see how men like to control women. And that links into that male gaze, that idea of men controlling women. So we're going to look at those ideas. So you're used to this now. I want you to, in a second, pause the video and just jot down your ideas. How do men view women in society? What do men fear socially? What are men worried about in society, in the world? And are relationships, romantic relationships, marriage, are they about power and control? Or is there something about, has that changed over time? So just pause the video and just have a bit of a think about it before we actually look at the poem in detail. So pause the video now and jot down your ideas. Okay, now a lot of these answers will depend on your perspective. I think sometimes people see things differently from each other. And we can see, how do men view women in society? Well, there are some different views in how women should be treated. And we know about, old sexist attitudes towards the way that women should be treated. And we can start thinking about how the Victorians, how do you think the Victorians would have viewed women in society? And then linking into that idea, what do men fear socially? Well, probably like most people, embarrassment and looking weak. And so that's one element, maybe. Are relationships about power and control? It's interesting that Before His Lover, that certainly was a poem that showed a man wanting to control. And we know how still today there are relationships that are based on controlling one another, manipulative relationships, and the idea of blackmailing people, so they stay with them, the fear, and using fear in that element. So we're going to have a look at the poem My Last Duchess now and see if those ideas, how do those ideas, how they appear in this poem. Now the poem is partly inspired by a historical situation. There was a Duke of Ferrara, and there was also Lucrezia, a duchess, and she died. He married her first wife, and she died, we believe, from poisoning, and people believe that he poisoned his first wife. So we know that Robert Browning was interested, and he did this quite a lot. He took historical figures and wrote them as a dramatic monologue. Again, I've broken down this poem into small little sections just to make it easier to read as we're going along. So this is My Last Duchess. Hurrah! That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder, now, for our Pandulph's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said, Fra Pandulph by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there, so not the first. Are you to turn and ask thus, Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek, perhaps Fra Pandolf, chance to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast. The dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all in each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush, at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift, 900 years old name, with anybody's gift, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss, or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, even that would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This group I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below. Then, I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed, at starting is my object, nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So very, very similar to Porphyry's lover. We've got a man about power and about control, and he's got a painting. And the painting he is showing to somebody who is helping him out with his next marriage. And as we know, marriage often, and in the time of the Renaissance and before, marriage was seen as a transaction, and marriage wasn't necessarily about love. It was about building connections, it was about raising status. So the idea that the Count is possibly going to give his daughter to the Duke would be a way of raising his status, because a Duke is got a higher status than a Count. So the idea is that this is about a marriage. So they're looking at new marriage, and so he's showing his old wife, a painting of his old wife, and then explaining the picture and talking about the picture, which shows us that idea of that male gaze, seeing the woman as an object. And this whole poem is about a woman as an object, and she is seen through a painting. So women again are objectified. So let's have a look at the big ideas then in the poem. So what is the poem saying to us then? How do men view women in society according to this poem? What do men fear socially? And are relationships about control and power? So just pause the video and just have a bit of think and jot down what your ideas do you think that this poem is saying about it. Okay, so let's have a look. So, how do men view women in society? Well, clearly the painting shows that they view them, according to this, in terms of an object. You know, they are a possession and something that they can control. And interesting that he talks about a curtain covering the painting. And actually, what the man can do, the Duke can do now, is he can control who sees and who doesn't see her now. So in a way, he's turned her into an object. He's by a suggestion that he's killed her, but actually she's become an object now, and so he's showing her off. And so there's two elements here. It's the fact that a woman is there to be shown off and to be boasting about, which is what he's doing. A little bit strange given that he's talking about his next marriage, which could be maybe a threat, the threat to the next person that, you know, look what happens if you mess about with me, I'm going to do this. But it's also the idea of how, what do men fear socially? Men fear, according to this, is this idea that they're not special. And so what he didn't like about her, this woman, was that the fact that her smile was the same smile that she gave for everybody, that she gave for the mule, that she gave for a man giving her cherries and things like that. And the fact that he didn't know what was going on in her mind. And so he feared that she was having an affair. And so it's that idea that men are fearful of women and scared of women because they hold that power over him, because he can't control her. So interesting ideas when you look at it, because when we look at Before His Lover, we see that idea of controlling women again, don't we? We see that idea of controlling women. How do you control a woman? By killing her. Really, really dark ideas. Now, remember what we said, that in the poem itself, that he is a social commentator. And you may think, you know, what are his ideas? Why is he saying such dark stuff and quite, you know, really, really sinister stuff? Well, I think he's using this scenario to show Victorian readers and people how men treat women. And he's putting the emphasis, and we're seeing how scary, we're seeing how bad it is, and we're seeing why he's behaving in this way. He fears what women do. Now, the totally innocent person in the poem is the Duchess. But then the poem in itself reflects the society, doesn't it? The society is that women don't have a voice in Victorian times. And so we can see that kind of, the man has got the power and the woman hasn't, and she's silent. What does it tell us about powers and relationships and control? Well, I think this poem shows us how men want to dominate women, and that kind of scary element that's in the poem itself. As I said, this is a very, very, you know, complex poem and quite a dark poem. And I think we've got to look at this from two angles, you know, look at it from a Victorian perspective and look at it from a modern perspective. If we look at it from a modern perspective, we can clearly see that this is about domestic abuse and that kind of relationships, that men or women control somebody in a relationship to the point that they can't exist. And that's what we're seeing in this poem. Okay, so now we're going to look at the poem and three images in the poem. So just pause the video and just think, why have we got these three images? So I've gone for the painting, I've gone for the smile, and I've gone for the last bit of the poem, which says about a statue. Notice Neptune taming a seahorse, which is cast in bronze. So just pause the video and have a bit of a think about, why do you think the poet chose those particular images? Okay, we're going to start off with the painting. The painting is an object, and if we think about this whole poem, the whole poem is about an object. it's about the painting. And so this poem, at its heart, is about treating a woman as an object and not seeing him as a person. And the fact that he's got curtains to control the way that people see this painting, and that he has got control over who can see it and who can't see it. And that is what is at the heart of this poem. Very much similar to Porphyria's lover, in that Porphyria's lover, he didn't want anybody else to love her or her to love anybody else, so he killed her for that. In this way, he's got her to himself, and he can look at her whenever he wants, but nobody else can unless he gives them permission. So he's got that control. So in the poem, if we look at what happens in the poem, the Duchess, she smiles and she thanks people. So she smiles at the horse, she smiles at somebody giving cherries, she smiles at the painter, who is probably a monk. The idea is that, smiling at all these people, yet he doesn't trust that smile. And so the image of the smile, and like Mona Lisa, is the idea that it is an enigma. It is a puzzle, because we know a smile can mean a number of different things. And the big problem that people have had with the Mona Lisa is they don't know why she's looking that way. And it's the big puzzle about the painting. What is it? What's she doing? Is she smirking? Is she smiling? Why is she smiling? What's the reason behind it? And it's become a big puzzle, because that's the thing that we don't understand what's going on in people's minds. And so this idea of the smile, he saw a smile, but he couldn't control what was going on behind her mind. So his idea was she flirting? And this smile was a flirtatious smile. And so for him, the smile represents her being promiscuous and possibly being sexual towards other people. And the fact that she was smiling, it was the same smile for him, made it even worse, because he expected something more from her. He wanted more from her, and that she was giving him the same smile that she was giving everybody else. So it's that kind of sense of fear, but then controlling it. And he couldn't control, and that's the nature of human life, isn't it? That you can't control people. You can ask them to do something, but in a relationship, this is where the problem stems for him. He couldn't control. Now, what's interesting is the last image in the poem, which is Neptune. Neptune, king of the seas, going from Greek mythology, and taming a seahorse. Now, a seahorse can be male or female, but we've got that idea of a male figure controlling something and taming. And I would say that the key word here is about taming, and the idea that he, the Duke, is Neptune, and the Duchess is the seahorse. And it's not killing the seahorse, but it's taming, and it's controlling the behavior of women. And it's this idea of a powerful man controlling a woman. And this idea about taming, and that a woman should behave how the man expects them to do. And so you can see a really, really interesting image. And that's the last image in the poem. And I would say that this whole poem is about that image. It's about man thinking he's God and thinking that women are there to be tamed. And so it's an interesting idea, because the Duchess doesn't have a voice in the poem. We don't hear her voice, do we? We only have his side. I remember what we said about Robert Browning being about a social commentator. Here we've got a man that suspects his wife is promiscuous and possibly having an affair. So he is taming. And in a way, we're seeing a comment on the way that men treat women in possibly Victorian times by using an example before Victorian times. So you can see that there's an interesting idea at the heart of this poem. Okay, let's have a look at the language now. So we're going to have a look at the language that's been used in here. So quickly, just pause the video and just have a jot down what you think you could say about how the language is used in the poem. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a look then. So in the poem, it doesn't really explicitly say that she was having a sexual relationship with other people. But the way that the poet uses language in here is there's lots of euphemisms. Now, euphemism is a politer way of saying something that's bad. And so here we've got thanked. But we've got thanked, which could be, how did she thank men? So she probably might have had sex with them. But I think the repetition of it is showing us the Duke's obsession and the obsession with her possibly having sex with other people. And so we get that idea of smiling and the idea of thanking people. So we've got that there. But we've also got how vague he is. He's somehow, I'm not sure what she did, but she somehow did something. So you can see how he's been particularly vague because he doesn't know. He doesn't know, but he thinks he knows. And so he uses the language to cage it up. He also does this later on. We're going to have a look at it. Even then would be stooping. And I choose never to stoop. Now, if we have a look at that verb stoop, so what does stoop mean? It means kind of bowing. And so this is about a man that refuses to be weak, refuses to show any weakness, his pride. So he won't bow. That's why we tend to bow. It's to show respect for somebody else, like a curtsy. So we bow for the Queen and curtsy for the Queen. So it's that idea of showing that they're more important than us. So he refuses to do that. He thinks he is the most important thing. Going back to Neptune, Poseidon. And so we've got the idea there of him. He thinks he's so great and he is so powerful that he will not give up or stoop down. So this is about status and about his pride. This screw I gave commands, then all smiles stopped. And again, we've got another euphemism. All smiles stopped. So again, the obsession that he has with her smiling is repeated again. But notice, he never killed her. Okay, and it doesn't even say that he killed her. He gave a command and she stopped smiling. But we assume from that she was killed in some way. But he gave commands. So he's that powerful, he doesn't have to kill her himself. He can get somebody to do that. So we can see that power that he's got there, that he's so protective about. And actually, with her supposedly having sex with somebody else, shows that he's not as powerful. And that's the fear that he's got. And then the last line that we've got, which Klaus Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Now, again, what we're seeing in the poem is this idea about status. And I do some bad writing because I can't write using the mouse, but we've got status. So he's, in a way, he's kind of name dropping. He's kind of saying a big designer brand almost, and say, oh yes, this is this. If this is a Ferrari, this is a Porsche. It's that kind of showing off how important he is. And in the poem, it ends with him showing off how important he is again. He's reasserting his strength, his position, his power. So we can see that in the poem in the way that it's done there. And that reference to a name is him showing off, and he's name dropping. And look how good I am. Because names are important and titles are important. And for example, it talks in the poem about how his gift of a 900-year-old name, that idea of his name being important than what she does, and she's throwing away his name. So you can see for him, status is more important. How the world see him is more than important than anything else. Right, moving on. So we're going to go back to the idea of it being a dramatic monologue, and we're going to look at the form. So we know that dramatic monologue was a form that Robert Browning used, but it gives us one perspective of an idea or an issue. So the idea that we've got here is that we're only seeing it from the man's perspective. So it is a biased perspective. And in a way, we can say that the dramatic monologue form shows us how women don't have a voice and how they're quietened, they're made silent in society. So it shows us how society treats women, that they don't get a say. There's no arguing back, there's no justifying. He clearly, by the sounds of the poem, didn't ask her what was going on, just killed her. He suspected something and so killed her. They're usually a narrative, so we've got a story, and we're going to have a look at how that's structured. But it focuses on the psychology of the voice. And that is, for me, what I think this poem is about. We're seeing what makes a man, particularly this man, what makes him behave the way in which he does. Now, from seeing this, we can see that he's not being rational and that he's being irrational. And you can see that the things that he's doing is taking small little things and making a fantasy of what's happening. And it's very much the way that Shakespeare uses soliloquies. We're listening to him so that we understand, not agree with, but understand why he's thinking about this. So we're seeing, and the soliloquy and also the dramatic monologue is about understanding the thought processes of the voice. So we understand why that person is thinking that particular thing. It's not about agreeing. In a way, I'd say what Browning's doing is trying to make us disagree with the voice, and for us to be so shocked at what's happened and the way that the woman is treated, and that's what he's doing. And in a way, I'd say the emphasis is more on shocking us about what this man can do so easily and how the woman is so silent in the whole situation. And in a way, we're a silent observer, and we're just being told. In a way, we kind of function as the next person in the line and the next suitor for him. Okay, now we're just going to have a look at the structure of the poem. So the structure of the poem is quite interesting because really we've got what we call a framing device. And a framing device is really a story within a story. So we've got the main story, which is the Count has sent somebody to talk to the Duke about marriage and a dowry payment for a marriage to the Count's daughter. And so in that situation, the Duke has shown this man to his gallery, and rich people would have galleries and lots of pieces of art. It's a very common thing to do. Certainly in the time the poem is set, would be to have a room, a big room. The bigger the room, the more rich you are, of lots of paintings and works of art, and you'd take people and you'd show off what pieces of art you got. So this is what he's doing. So he's showing how rich he is, and it's an opportunity for him to boast. And in the middle of that, we have this story. and it's the story of the Duchess. And so you can see that we don't have a normal story as such that starts, begin, middle, end. We kind of have this event, but then in a way kind of a flashback as he's explaining through the painting. And so that's what we've got in terms of the way that the poem's structured. Okay, so remember, once we've got our ideas and we've spotted some interesting things about the way the poem's written, we're going to think about what is the poet actually teaching us and moving that level up. It's not just okay to just talk about techniques. We've got to say more about the poem. What is the poet trying to do? So he's, I would say, attacking power and how people with power control people. It makes a good connection to London. So think about how the people in power separate themselves with those that don't have power. So the blood on the palace walls. This is also exposing how people control others in a relationship. It's about that controlling, that manipulating, bullying approach that some have in relationships. It's about the fear of women and the idea that from a patriarchal viewpoint is that Victorian society and before in Shakespeare's time is that men were feared and they weren't trusted, and so they were seen as devious. And so this is what we've got in the poem, this idea of a woman who is having sex outside of a marriage. The only evidence we've got for it is that she smiled. That's the only evidence, but it's the fear of women, and it's the fear that we've got driving this poem. The Duke fears what the woman might or could have done, but not what she's actually done. It's also a poem about the past and the impact of the past. Now we know that Robert Browning was associated with the Romantics. So the Romantics were against urbanization, they were against the Industrial Revolution. They were looking at the past, and like Ozymandias, they were looking at the past and lessons from the past, and in a way, a kind of romanticized way. So they were looking at the past to help them understand the present. This is a poem about the relationship between men and women, and remember that Browning wrote a book of poems called Men and Women, and think about Before His Lover, about looking about the power dynamic between men and women and in relationships. And remember we said that he was a social commentator, so a bit like Dickens. What is he saying about men and women in society? Also the idea of objectifying women, treating women as objects. And this fear of women surrounded about deception, this idea of deception. And there's two levels of deception. There's the deception of the woman, supposedly, but actually the man's deception, because in a way he's deceiving himself to think that he has controlled the woman. So remember, when we're looking at the poem and when we're thinking about the poem, we need to be thinking, where else can we see it in the poem? So for example, can we see other elements of power in there? So for example, if we're talking about power, we can talk about the painting and the curtain covering the painting, but also we can talk about the statue at the end of the poem, can't we? Think about what stance the poet have, what is the poet aiming to do, and what was going on at the time. So think about Victorian times, think about Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. Are there elements of bits that we can make connections or help our understanding with that bit? Now, remember, one of the things we're going to have to do in the exam is make connections between the poem. So what we see in this poem is the power of the rich. Now, I've already talked about London, but we could talk about Ozymandias, can't we? This idea about being powerful and trying to control that power and trying to keep that power and maintain it. We've also got the power of men and how we see men dominating other people and men being cruel. We've got the power of objects, and we see that quite a lot in the number of the poems, whether it's Ozymandias, but also the power of, for example, boat in the prelude. Tiny boat is not strong enough against a massive mountain and nature. We've also got the conflict between image and reality. You know, the painting is not a reflection of the reality. And for example, we've got war photographer. We can see that idea. The painting doesn't match the reality. And so we can see that idea about image and reality. Conflict between men and women. Okay, so we've got a number of poems that are written by men, but we've got one or two poems written by women. Now, personally, I think there should be an equal balance, but there isn't. But we can have a look at that and talk about how men and women view things differently or similarly. And then we've got the conflict between life and death. So we've got poems to do with death. So, for example, Remains. Remains makes a good connection because, you know, this is about, Remains is a poem where the man is trying to forget the murder. And in a way, this poem is he doesn't want to forget it because that gives him strength and power. Okay, we've done this before. Quick questions then. So pause the video and jot down what answers you think should be here. And as soon as the pause symbol disappears, we'll go through the answer together. And pause now. Okay, let's go through the answers then. So where's the poem take place? It's Ferrara in Italy, northern Italy. What type of poem is this? It's a dramatic monologue. What gift did he give her that he thinks she was ungrateful for? And that was the gift of a 900 years old name, the title Duchess. What tea did she often do? And that's thanked. What sea is she covered with at the moment? And that's a curtain. What S was a notable thing that she showed? And that was her smile. What two pronouns does the Duke use to describe the Duchess? And that's she and my. What piece of punctuation does the writer use to show the anger and the breakdown in his thoughts? And that's the dashes. And what euphemism does the Duke use in relation to the Duchess? So there's a number of euphemisms there. So there's thanked, smiled, but also the smile stopped together. So we can do that. Reminder that we've got other videos. We've got videos from cluster 1 and we'll be having videos from cluster 2 shared on the YouTube channel. So do subscribe. Remember, the videos will stay there for you for the mock exam and for future exams, helping you making sure. So if there's a poem you're not sure about, watch the video again, make sure you understand it. Remember, we've only gone through a few bits of the poem. I would suggest that you do have a look at the poem and annotate it closely and read it closely. And there are other things that we've not mentioned that you could use in your answer when writing about poems.